It's not a lasting conversion.
No, it's typical of science to have a short term. I'm excited about it now, but a falling away.
Yeah, I've often wondered if Reformed Egyptian has quotation marks. Probably doesn't. But if they were converted, because then you go over to chapter 2, verse 1, came to pass that thus passed away the 95th year also, and the people began to forget those signs and wonders which they had heard. In our verse 22, we learned from verse 26, it was the 92nd year. So within 3 years, they're not so converted. And
so you wonder if it's just a change in outward behavior rather than a change of heart sometimes.
Yeah, and I think we have that too. It says they began to disbelieve what they had heard, imagining up some vain thing. And I think we can see that in the church too. You might have a young man fill a mission. He has great, marvelous experiences, feels the Spirit, sees miraculous things, comes home, and then goes inactive. You can talk to him and say, where did you go? Who's your president? What happened? He knows all the facts. But the thing that's different is he doesn't have that spiritual witness again. And I think they could still say these things happen, but the spiritual witness of what it was really happening, that seems to be lacking.
It stops being an influence in their life.
Right.
Yeah. Then we get a little bit of a contention in verse 24. Todd, I know you also had some thoughts on that.
Well, let's just read the problem that came up. Verse 24. There were no contentions save it were a few that began to preach, endeavoring to prove by the Scriptures that it was no more expedient to observe the law of Moses. Now in this thing they did err, having not understood the Scriptures. But it came to pass that they soon became converted, and they were convinced of the error which they were in, for it was made known unto them that the law was not yet fulfilled, and that it must be fulfilled in every whit. Yea, the word came unto them that it must be fulfilled. Yea, that one jot or tittle should not pass away till all should be fulfilled. Therefore, in this same year were they brought to a knowledge of this error, and did confess their faults. I think we can see modern examples of this. Sometime, almost every general conference, you hear rumors that there's going to be some big announcement, and I don't even want to mention what they are to promote them. But you have to wait until the revelation comes.
Even though they knew that eventually the law would be...
It was going to come, but their timing
fulfilled.
was wrong.
Yeah, it was talked about back in 2 Nephi chapter 25, verse 24. They kept the law of Moses, even though they knew that eventually it would be fulfilled and it would be done away with. So they're aware of the prophecies. They're just, like you said, they're getting the timing wrong.
They saw the sign and they think, boy, this is the time, and know that had to be corrected. And we need to be a little careful to not run with the rumors, but go with the brethren, and they'll let us know when things are come to pass, and we don't need to speculate and try to get into that kind of stuff.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's also a sharp contrast with the Jews and at the time of Christ, who didn't want to, even after the gospel was there, they still didn't want to give up the law of Moses. So it's almost the opposite there. Mm-hmm. These people are anxious to give it up. The Jews didn't want to, even after Christ had come.
I think one other thing that's in this verse, a little different perspective than that said, is I think behind this we're seeing all of this wickedness. And I ask myself, well, there's going to be 12 apostles or disciples called from this, and there's a prophet here. And I think this verse also shows a healthy church that is able, as Todd said, that it isn't scholars sitting around and saying, is it finished now, and we make the decision. It looks like church down leadership from the brethren down. No, here's how it went. So they're receiving instructions somewhere in this verse.
Mm-hmm. Now back in Helaman, at the close of the book of Helaman, the Lamanites were more righteous than the Nephites. And now the Lamanites begin to lose some of that righteousness. I know, Michael, you've had some thoughts on verse 30 of chapter 1 there.
Yeah, in the few verses previous to that, it talks about the growth of the Gadianton robbers, and now it says even the children of the Lamanites start joining these gangs, quite appropriate for our own time. And it says, and thus were the Lamanites afflicted also, and began to decrease as to their faith in righteousness, because of the wickedness of the rising generation. These are decent, good parents who are holding family home evening and teaching the gospel, and still, because of external influences, some of their children are being led astray. And I think sometimes in the church we have the false notion that if you're a good parent, you'll never lose your kids, when in fact in this wicked society in which we live, you can do the best you can and still lose them, and these good Lamanite parents see that happening. So
it must have been heartbreaking for them.
Yeah, absolutely, as it is for us.
Yes. Well, in chapter 2, verse 1, we have the people beginning to forget the signs and wonders, as you mentioned earlier, Tom. They had seen them, but it isn't that they forgot the signs and wonders themselves. What they forget is the importance of them, what they mean in their lives, and so on and so forth. And they begin to rationalize there in verse 2. Michael, I think you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, imagining up some vain thing in their hearts that it was wrought by men and by the power of the devil to lead away and deceive. The factual information is unchanged. It's their approach to it, and this rationalization process seems to be, and it clearly indicates that it's because of sin. As soon as you start sinning, the light goes out, and you want to rationalize why you're sinning, and so you've got to explain away things that before seemed so clear and true and believable.
Good. Yes. Now going on down to verses 5 and 6, we get a little bit of chronology mentioned here. And before I turn to you, Todd, you're going to talk about how their time reckoning happens right around verse 8. But before that, I want to make a general remark here. Sometimes we try and correlate the Nephite calendar with our own calendar. And I think there's a question that we have to ask ourselves first before we can attempt to do that. And until we can answer this question, it's going to be somewhat difficult to make the exact correlation there between them. For instance, it's well known that the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. And without the intercalary months that are added periodically to bring it back in line with the solar calendar, it gets off from the solar calendar. And that's a 360-day year. So were the Nephites using the solar calendar 360 days a year? Or were they using perhaps an Egyptian calendar, which one of the Egyptian calendars, a 365-day year, instead of the 365 and a quarter days, which was the Julian calendar? Certainly they were not using our Gregorian calendar with 365 and a quarter minus a little bit, because we drop out leap year. And so you have to know which calendar they're using before you can try and get the exact correlation. I just want to mention that it might not ever be possible to figure out which calendar they were using. Nevertheless, they were using a typical Near Eastern way of keeping track of time, and that is by eras. And I think, Todd, you wanted to say something about that.
Well, just from what's there, verse 5, 100 years had passed away since the days of Messiah, who was king over the people of the Nephites, and 609 years had passed away since Lehi left Jerusalem. And then down to verse 8, now the Nephites began to reckon their time from this period when the sign was given. So I think just a big picture here is they first used to just have something that happened as a reckoning point, and that was from the time Lehi left Jerusalem. So in our calendar, that would be from about 600 BC down to the second way of reckoning, and that was the time of the judges, which was about 92 BC. And then they go, because they say several times, since the reign of the judges, when that was put in at the ending of the book of Messiah, with King Messiah before his death. And then they mentioned 9 years passed away from the time the sign was given. So they still were talking reign of judges for a while, but after 9 years, people, I think, had kept saying since the sign, and so they just switched over and said from the time the sign was given, so that they used until the end of the record. And that coincides with what we do, the time of Jesus' birth. So you've got those three, from the time Lehi left, the reign of the judges, and from the time the sign was given.
And that's the system they're going to use throughout the rest of the Book of Mormon.
That's their reference points.
Yeah, it's interesting that they would choose that same reference point, which the Christians in the old world came to a couple of centuries after the birth of Christ, but they're picking it up earlier here.